Thing?
I think this is the thing, baby.
God damn it. Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
welcome to the third ever Monarchism Unfiltered Q&A.
Yeah.
We're on the Discord and we're taking questions from the fans.
Somehow we've reached the point that we can say we have fans. Truly, the world is going down a drain.
Well, we have viewers at least, listeners, whatever the fuck we call them.
Well, please let's not develop a pet name for our listeners. They're just the listeners.
They're just the listeners. They are our little brothers. No,
I just said no pet names, goddammit.
God damn it.
That's creepy, yo. Fucking
Yo, parasocial relationships, though.
Yeah. Okay. In any point, yeah, we've been having a couple of technical issues with this one, as I guess is rapidly becoming a tradition. So please forgive us for any other for more issues than are usual these days. So, things. So let's begin. Where the hell is the Q&A channel? Oh yeah, it's strategy of the questions. I was looking for Q&A. Okay, so who's here?
We can begin with today's first question from Young Loaf. Young Loaf, you have been unmuted. You may ask your question.
All right. Cool. So I was wondering, what exactly makes a monarchy legitimate, specifically in a Catholic perspective with the divine right of kings and all that?
Okay. That is an incredibly interesting question, and indeed, in fact, one of the most intensely important ones in the world of monarchism. So, I'm going to tackle. We'll split this into two bits. I'll tackle the material aspect of the question of legitimacy, while I'll leave the precise theological reasoning to the resident Anglo-Catholic. So hopefully he can give you a better explanation than my admittedly simplistic understanding. Of the divine right of kings. Well, not simplistic, but sometimes inconsistent, I guess.
Also, just to make sure neither of us are experts or theologians or priests, so you know.
So yeah, to expect high quality on this is bold, to say the least. Okay, so legitimacy is an interesting concept, especially in its material conceptibilities, because it has intense material. I've said material 2 times. It has a very specific material condition. Legitimacy is effectively a social thing. Essentially, a monarch is legitimate because effectively he acts the part of a legitimate monarch. There is no true hard and fast rule that was historically verified, I guess. Like they did exist, but they were inconsistent. Basically, a legitimate Chinese monarch had a different conception of a legitimate Western monarch, etc., etc. But they all had a similarity, and this is the sociological, materialist, psychological aspect of this. You see, like for example, Versailles is. People don't generally think the excesses of Versailles as being a manifestation of legitimacy, but the truth of the matter, it is. Because, for example, if a monarch appeared in front of any of us wearing a fucking hoodie and looking like literally a thug, we would not consider him legitimate, essentially. Like, sure, we may have not used the word, but there is an undeniable aesthetical quality to legitimacy, and you see this, and you see this to this day when between Syria, like the focus and respect we give to quote unquote serious things that are not necessarily intrinsically better or more respectful, but they just give that air that we consider them more important and relevant than more casual things. So legitimacy is kind of a reflection on that, except applied to society and to the actions of the king. Because legitimacy does not necessarily correlate with morality. Nicholas II was the legitimate Tsar until he got killed. That does not mean he was, well, until he got overthrown. That does not mean he was the good Tsar. So legitimacy is a concept that is both independent from the morality of one's actions, but also at the same time connected. It also has a material component that is tied to aesthetics, which it's one half, and these aesthetics are one half royal propaganda. Consider the Sun King and his presentation of the monarch as this I guess retroactively proto-Hegelian being that is outside of the that is above society, that essentially has this almost aura around him whose physical materialization of said quote unquote aura is the extensive wealth, etc. Historically, this also had its impact on diplomacy. Essentially, how wealthy a king was portrayed was also a direct counterpart to how legitimate his fellow monarchs saw themselves. I mean, this happens to this day with states. While it's no longer so much as a thing of like how good is the building in which in which the people who call the shots reside. There's a few more elements beyond that. That is still a part of the thing. So when we're talking about legitimacy in a historical context, the material and sociological implications of it are often intensely complicated and related. Because, for example, in China, early China, especially when legalism was at its strongest, the legitimacy of the monarch in a practical sense did not quite come from heaven per se, because heaven worship and divine and the mandate of heaven was not exactly solidly confined, especially in the early with the first dynasty, the Qin. But the legitimacy came out almost out of a process. The monarch was essentially this cog in a machine, and it was the fact that he was inserted in this machine that effectively kind of self-legitimized him. You also have a distinct but related concept to this in titulature, which is the title of autocrat, self-ruler, essentially, which harkens back to other conceptualizations of monarch in the East. But suffice to say, it is also a kind of I am legitimate by myself. So legitimacy was not always a concrete thing. It had multiple possible origins, and the way you lost it was often debated. One could argue that the Carlist branch never lost their legitimacy. One could argue that they did, vice versa, the mainline Bourbon branch as well. So when talking about the material aspects of legitimacy, the short answer is it's an incredibly complicated thing that there is no true set definition. But suffice to say that it often encourages an aesthetical part of the legitimacy of the Queen of England is that she essentially presents herself as the Queen of England. I know this is almost a tautology. Maybe it's in fact a direct tautology, but
the tautology club meets when the tautology club meets.
Wow, couldn't resist. But yeah, I think we also could have unmuted Love, since he can give his own quips. But yeah, I think that this covers the material part. If you want to go with the specifics of the divine right of kings, Bronze.
The divine right of kings is a very interesting notion. Because obviously so many different people have had so many different conceptions of what it means. Okay, I need to...
Your time. Again, this has no time limit.
There's no time limit on the Q&A. We are just vibing. Yeah. No, so I mean, the divine right of kings, as understood in the European context, sort of, evolves out of these biblical terms of these great things of Judea in the Old Testament is what they like to think of themselves as. But obviously, it doesn't really come into play in a major way until Pepin the Short. I think he's the first divine right of kinger. When he starts, conspiring, well, not conspiring, but cooperating with the Pope. But obviously, even before Pepin, there had been scholars writing about this, like Augustine had a sort of a conception of a divine right of kings. But obviously, he focused more on the divine bit than the king's bit. And then and then it reaches a sort of a higher stage, a plateau in the high Middle Ages when it's tied to the popes, and you obviously have the high medieval mega popes. And then it gets a new vital spirit during the age of absolutism, because then the king is directly trying to oppose himself to the church and other, competing sources of authority. And that's when you'd see stuff like, Anglicanism, Gallicanism, and all of that stuff. And there are several kings who write about the divine right of kings. The most famous among them is James VI of Scotland, who writes his the Basilicon Doron, which is sort of like a manual that he writes for his son Henry Frederick. Although Henry Frederick never comes to be king because he dies very young, and then his son Charles takes over. And obviously, Charles is a very important case study in the divine right of kings, because there's a whole civil war and the Cromwell and all of that happens. That's like a very, very, very brief history of the idea of the divine right of kings.
The thing is that, as said, although like a lot of people, especially in the West, talk about the divine right of kings, if there was only one single interpretation of the divine right of kings. In fact, there are multiple. You have please correct me on this one, Bronze, but because I often mistake the Augustinian with the
Thomistic?
Saint Thomas, the Thomistic, because essentially one of them is pluralistic. Essentially, it affirms that multiple kings can be legitimate, while one is almost divine, while the other is almost a divine mandate of heaven, in that there can only be one king, and therefore in Europe in their conception there was one legitimate king, which I don't actually know who they considered to be, and all the others were effectively usurpers, which is not a position. I mean, some do have that position, but one does not expect that to be the case, a potential case in any Western conception of the divine right of kings, because of the historical reality that was. But it is possible. Another thing to be aware is that the concept of basically losing divine mandate, because both without reason and with reason and 2/3 propaganda, essentially absolutism is correlated with tyranny, and divine right of kings is correlated as the perfect excuse for abuse.
It's correlated as the king can do whatever he wants.
Exactly, except that's not the case.
Yeah.
If we are to go with the only truly workable notion of divine right of kings, the one that works back when applied to history, at least in a simple matter, unless you want to go through there's some pretty insane loops and hollows to say, oh yeah, no, we had these shit tons of kings, but only one of them is legitimate, and the logistics gets complicated. The simple one, which I think is the Augustinian one, effectively says this: a king is legitimate and has divine right of kings while he rules in accordance with the church. In practical terms, this is with natural law, Catholic social teaching, and, very importantly, is not a tyrant. Now, the word tyrant gets thrown a lot these days, and I mean, it used to have a very concrete etymological meaning, but now it doesn't. And it essentially just means bad ruler, and this is the way it was deployed. But St. Augustine had a very interesting conceptualization of tyranny that actually made his concept the most workable. And to reduce it to the absolute minimum, his concept of tyranny was none other than tyranny is negligence by the part of the governed.
That's Suarez.
God damn it. I said at the beginning of this triad that I mixed them up because I'm atrocious with names. Ah, God, what fucking credibility do I have now? I mix up the names.
Oh, the names. Oh, yeah, none of us have ever done that.
Okay,
Mixing
but
up.
I got a question though.
Is it intrinsically related with this? With
yes,
this
it is intrinsically related. So you could have, like, you know, what example should I use? Would you kill me if I used France as an example?
Yes. So don't.
Okay.
Wait, unless you're asking, unless your specific question is how does divine right of
Yeah.
kings works between dynasties?
Yeah, that's what it is. So could you have theoretically, like, the King of France be a Bonapartist who is in accordance with Catholic social teaching, isn't a
Yes,
tyrant or anything, but still say that the legitimist claimant is the legitimate king?
yes. Under the, I hope, the Suarezian version, you could, because
Okay.
it's non-exhaustive essentially.
Yeah.
Because it also has to do, because the concept of divine right of kings, which is often thrown in a vacuum, is actually very strongly tied to Catholic notions of like necessity. Of, well, basically like necessary political institutions towards governing of the state, towards governing of the people. Um, uh, so the So very, very simply is that, reducing to the absolute minimum, the Catholic Church recognizes no other necessary political body than the Church. A question can be raised on my usage of the term political body for the Church, but suffice to say, the Church is a single thing that the Catholic Church considers to be necessary as close as it comes to political organization. So the divine right of kings comes up to is not something that pops out of the blue. It pops out of like how, because it's Christian theology. Okay, the church is the only thing necessary. Then what is the point of all of the other states? The truth is complicated because, again, I'm not particularly well versed in this, and as I've evidenced in the past, write this Q&A, I'm shit with names. But essentially, the divine right of kings comes to not only provide legitimacy to monarchy as such, but essentially to provide legitimacy to government, the abstract concept when separated from the church. That divine right of kings emerged as in a specifically pro-monarchical form rather than just divine right of state or whatever formulation. That is directly connected to, as Bron said earlier in his bit, to essentially biblical readings about the old kings of the Bible. A good person that gives a very solid account of the divine right of kings in this biblical patriarchal way, though do mind it's the book, you do require a somewhat solid grasp of like I try a somewhat solid grasp of Catholic theology and like to get what he means, or biology, because It is Robert Filmer's Patriarchy, The Divine Right of Kings, and a lot of his claims, which are biblical, actually bottom out into biological. Essentially, his claim, while also being the origin point of anti-contractualism, fundamentally comes from a king. Kings and queens are both the parent and the mother of the people. And essentially, much like a parent has the power of life and death over their child, so does the king and the mother and the queen over their people in an abstract sense. As you might have guessed, this doesn't say much, and hence why in the Divine Right of Kings, before and after Phil wrote down his book. So again, like, this is more to contextualize the concept of the divine right of kings as it emerged in Catholic thinking. Okay.
Yeah, I feel like that makes sense. And instead of doing the questions in order, we're going to sort of string them as we can theme-wise. And so I think a good follow-up question to that would be a question that we just got from Sasha about Suarez and Aquinas. Hello, Sasha. What is your question?
Thank you very much. So my question is the following. How does Francisco Suarez's writings on the permissibility of revolt and revolution differ from Thomas Aquinas' writings on the subject? Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. That's a very interesting question. And obviously, I'm not I think it's safe to say neither of us an expert on both. But I would say Suarez continues in the vein of Aquinas. Although, because he has the gift of happening after Aquinas, he can afford to be a lot more detailed about his thoughts than Aquinas's. And so, while Aquinas has a general vibe of you should follow, you shouldn't revolt unless not doing so would violate law, and also that the result of the revolution being successful would be better than it not happening. So, you know, the society of post-revolution would be better. You know, that improvement would offset the damage caused by like the physical fighting of the revolution. Suarez agrees with that, but then continues in the vein of that he delineates circumstances much more explicitly where he thinks it's okay. Because obviously, he exists after the Reformation, and his most famous work, you know, in defense of the apostolic faith, is a direct response to the coronation oath of Kings James VI and First of England and Scotland, who, of course, himself formulated an absolutist and treatise based on the divine right of kings, the Basilicon Doron. And he says that, as McCoskey was pointing out, that the highest form of tyranny is negligence. But he takes quite a complex view of what negligence means. It doesn't just mean that, you know, he's absent-minded, but also he can be spiritually negligent, which is what he holds most of the Protestant princes of Europe to be. And therefore, to the mind of Suarez, it is okay to revolt against a prince who has not recognized universal law, that being, you know, that revealed the natural law of the Catholic Church, including unum sanctum, which he holds to be very important. Because being very schooled in law, he formulates a framework in which unum sanctum is the basis for a system of international law. And so he thinks that if a state acts out against that law, then the revolt is permissible.
If this seems oddly similar to conceptions of international law under the UN and rogue states and what have you, that's because it was inspired. Like, it's like, yeah, Suarez turns out Suarez, big important dude of the past, an excellent writer, influential.
very influential, but not for some reason not as well known in the English world as he perhaps should be, but obviously incredibly famous in the Spanish-speaking world.
Yeah. But as said, and as I mentioned, like Suarez's conception of divine right of kings is the most workable, both on just workability, because it just defines shit more often, and also like it's easier to mesh with the current contemporary international world order. Like in a hypothetical restoration / implementation of any absolute monarchy in the contemporary world, such monarchy would have to contend with the international order, and Suarez's understanding is is um, better. I mean, it's much more workable than, for example, I am almost certain this is not the whole story, but the Sunni Muslim view of what confers on legitimacy. And again, I cannot vouch for the exhaustiveness of this answer, but essentially it boils down to, if the monarch is God-fearing, he is legitimate. If this did not indirectly answer the questions of why did the steppes convert to Islam, and why so many people converted to so many kingdoms converted to Islam later, especially in Central Asia being the main driver. If this strange dynamic didn't help to explain it, I'll illustrate. Essentially, how do you prove someone is God-fearing? It's a bit complicated, basically, and like that's kind of an issue. Now, not to say that most Islamic monarchs were tyrants in waiting, were abusive, etc. I'm saying that atheistic Muslim monarchs did not have the best track record, because essentially the balance there was couched on not from the revolt of the people per se, but on divine punishment. And if a monarch was incredibly pious and genuinely believer, he would act into accordance to the mores of the Muslim faith. An excellent example of this is the Zanidea dynasty of Persia. If he wasn't, well, you have Nader Shah of Persia, and depending upon your exact interpretation, Tamerlane as well. He was devout, but I wouldn't exactly call him God-fearing. So, and this again is and as I said, a most likely insufficient and reduced understanding of what like the Muslim concept of divine right boils down to. So hopefully this inspires our Muslim viewers to actually comment and like correct us in the comments.
Yeah.
Next question.
Next question. We can take a question from Juanito Alemania. Juanito, what is your question?
Oh, well, I guess the first one is the one. I mean, you guys kind of answered that one, but the question: why should the people be loyal to the person of the monarch? I think this is, despite the thought of just good old tradition, it seems that for modern people, we have a very hard time understanding why we should be loyal to the person of the monarch itself, the institution, and the person.
Yeah, very good question, but it's a difficult question to answer a priori, which is why it's difficult to convince people, because it is simple to justify it based on like game theory on benefits taken, but some people just consider such type of reasoning to be insufficient and require an a priori reason. I'm rather neutral in that requirement, because to each one's own in that regard. But why loyalty to the king itself? Right, the specific human being, the person. And as you were correct, Juanito, this intersects with the questions we were talking about the fine right of kings, etc., etc., etc. And again, I suppose on a Catholic / Christian perspective, to include also the Protestants and the Anglicans, like we kind of answer it on that level, because because God says so, and effectively he follows the church, the social doctrine, isn't a tyrant. In a more, shall we say, secular context, why loyalty to the person of the king is, to boil it down to the absolute structural minimum, like the root zero. Because the king structurally has the interests of the country, and he essentially has the same interests because he is the country on a not a literal sense, obviously, but on a functional sense. Like, what is the existence of the king separate from his country? The answer is there is none. He only exists within the context of being a monarch, and that requires a kingdom and a society, etc., etc., etc. So, in a limited, not limited, like this is fundamentally true, but insufficient when compared to reality. But is that if the king is interested in continuing to be king long term, he will look out for the best interest of the country, because that's the best way for him to remain king. So there is this kind of institutional drive, because, like, what is the agenda of a king? What could possibly be the agenda of a king other than remaining king for long, and if you're highly cynical, increase their power? How would he go about these two methods? It's rather irrelevant, because the method would always be to have the best interests of the country at heart, to improve this or that, to acquire popularity. So, like, there is, from a structural perspective, tremendous benefits in being loyal to the king, because there is no other loyalty to, because a loyalty to any other group other than the king has a very clear-cut goal, which is to take power from the king onto the extreme, while the king just wants to maintain it. So you have this notion that the king wants to be an equalizer, so no one can usurp him. Again, I'm going here about a bit on circles, going on a very institutional analysis, and it again boils down to being loyal to the king has structural benefits, but this isn't really an a priori reason. Like, you can ask the fundamental question: why would people be loyal to a republic? You can think of what you want for a priori reasoning, and they will all fall flat, because it bottoms down into because it is beneficial to an extent. And for monarchy and in the individual king, the answer would all eventually boil down into because it is beneficial. Essentially, there are structural reasons for that to be the case, which don't verify in monarchy, in republic, self-evidently. The justification there comes from a bit in the democratic understanding of legitimacy, which is democratic legitimacy, effectively begs the question of, should we give democratic legitimacy? It automatically just assumes that any single being exists with it a priori, which is not necessarily the same thing which is okay. Let me rephrase, because I was getting a bit scattered from right. The question of why should we be loyal to X, the answer will almost always boil down because it brings benefit, unless you include ideological or theological elements to this, which they have their own rationality. Any royalism would specify the individual monarch and dynasty, much like any other ideology would specify the exact form of government and its contents. The republics and democracies in general do not have actually a more satisfactory answer than it, because in such conditions it would be beneficial. Because fundamentally, when they frame that question answer, they frame it wrongly. They frame it as, why should we follow the government? Because the government has democratic legitimacy, and because the people vote in it. This is kind of putting the question on the wrong horse, because the true question that is being asked is, why should a priori a people confer legitimacy to X or Y Z democratic government? And that's kind of the question that. So unrelated, but I was saying that it is an issue that is not exclusive to monarchism. It is inclusive to everyone. Merely others have material advantages, and that's the case currently, but not actual ideological a priori justifications. We're all kind of in the same bag in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Next question.
Let's keep going down. We have a question once more from Sasha, this time about the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. My question is a very interesting one, and admittedly, one that got the attention of many people. So the following question is, how did the Netherlands transition from a prominent republic to a monarchy?
That is an excellent question, my friend. You don't even know how good it is. So, the transition from proeminent republic to monarchy, in the case of the Netherlands, you can look at it in two angles: the long form one and the short form one. The long form one effectively focuses on the dynamic of stadtholder, the House of Orange, and whatever wasn't the stadtholder and the House of Orange in the United Provinces throughout its history, and the role the House of Orange played into it. The short form of it, which is equally as interesting, it's just, I think, the easiest one to explain in this context without going through, admittedly, what would be like 200 years of history in the thing. So I'll focus on the short form. And the short form is intensely interesting, because you can look at it as a retroactive example of modern day dynamics of power, say governmentalization of power, fusion of powers, presidentialization of power, etc. And it has an intensely emotional aspect. So, pre Republican France invasion of the Netherlands, United Provinces, under a stadtholder of the House of Orange, because all stadtholders were essentially from the House of Orange. They get invaded, they get conquered, Batavian Republic established. Batavian Republic doesn't do much. Kingdom of Holland established. And very key to this process is that you have the tragically underlooked figure of Louis the Good. I hope for the sake of everything, I'm not mistaking his name.
That is his name.
Oh, thank heavens! Louis the Good of Holland. So, I'll save you. I'll save you the details, but essentially, Louis the Good is not only I think, a excellent, a fantastic human being and a beacon of what all monarchies should be. He, above all, by his extremely good conduct and admiral even, effectively legitimized the existence of monarchy to the Dutch people in a very simplistic way. They lived under a monarchy. Their monarch even fought to maintain the independence of their people versus his older brother, the Emperor Napoleon. So you have this very simplistic but very powerful, I suppose. Hey, this monarchy business isn't atrocious. It's functional, and its king actually fought for our benefit. Fought for our benefit against his own brother. Like this, this kind of stuff has its impact. So, jumping from that, the Kingdom of Holland gets invaded by Napoleon. And then the Kingdom of Holland, and then the Napoleonic system, the continental system, whatever name you want to call to Napoleon's alliance of kingdoms, principalities, republics, gets overthrown, and you enter Holland, and now you have an intense issue, because you had a very intense period in which you had an ineffectual republic that was easily overthrown, and that many people believed would fold immediately to Napoleon, vis-a-vis a monarchy that, against all odds and expectations, fought for the rights, independence, for the rights of its own people, against the literal brother of the king, who literally put them on the throne. So, two important issues to be aware of is also memory, because in this consideration of like, okay, so maybe this monarchy stuff isn't so bad, it's actually a valid question. It becomes a question of, okay, return to normality. What is normality for the Dutch Republic? It was a period between having stadtholders and non-stadtholders. There's always this historical tug of war between the two. But at the moment, the only person they could think and ultimately remember as being a rightful monarch, as being essentially the beacon of normality, was the previous stadtholder, soon to be, I think it was actually his son. I think he actually died soon-ish after the first king of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, which at the time included Belgium. So there was this very curious interplay of essentially memory, experience, and emotion that are kind of the short form explanation of why it happened. Basically, the perceptions about republicanism, about its republic, were challenged. The period of extreme instability and the return to normalcy, they focused on the embodiment of the system as they could remember it, and that was the stadtholder of the House of Orange.
Yeah.
Did that answer the question in a satisfactory way?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So we can go on to take a question from Poggers, but as he is not here, I will read the question. And he asks, what is the ideal city?
A city without cars.
A city without cars is a good answer.
But okay.
But here's the
Okay.
thing, because earlier in our questions chat, there has been mentioned a book by St. Thomas Aquinas called De Regno, which is a book that he wrote for the king of Cyprus, who asked him for advice on how to be a good king. And what is interesting is that Aquinas in De Regno actually talks a bit about how you should build a city. And he talks about how the city has to be reasonably self-sufficient. So in a sense, he was sort of autarkical. But the reason he gives is interesting, in that Aquinas says that a city should be self-sufficient, because then it doesn't need to rely on merchants, because merchants are shady people. Which I think is one of the more interesting autarkical arguments.
More reasonable of them all, if people remember. It's a lot better than the ecological argument for autarky.
Yeah, the anti-merchant version.
Yeah.
Yeah, but on a more serious note, I think, for one, the ideal city is very surroundings dependent. Right, and I don't think there exists like a formula for one type of ideal city that you could put everywhere on the earth.
Are you telling me that that ideal city shouldn't have everything in it be a factor of 12?
No, obviously, an ideal city would have an amount of citizens that is a highly composite number.
Self-evident. That's another obtuse reference that no one will get. Okay.
Yeah, no, so clearly, or if the city is bigger than that, all parts of the city should be divided into districts that all have 5,040 citizens.
This is now, I think, a direct reference to the Regno. But again,
this is a direct reference to Plato. Plato says,
Jesus Christ, names and books. How the fuck did I get here? How the fuck am I held out as a person whose opinions are respectable?
Are you? No. Okay.
Fair point. I don't know. In any case.
No. Yeah, but Plato says that high, and also, can I just talk a little bit about highly composite numbers?
No.
No. Okay.
You're shooting that one off the sky. I'm terribly sorry for the math heads we have.
The math heads and the people who use the imperial system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a non-zero number to my endless horror.
Well, that's because it's based on. No, never mind.
Okay, but another thing is that what is the ideal city is an interesting question, because it directly relates to the heavenly city and the earthly city of Augustine. No.
You were so glad. It is Augustine.
Okay.
Tis him.
Because like it sure says in St. Thomas of Epona, also known as St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, it shows up, but it is actually a prominent motif in Augustine's most famous and most important book, The City of God.
Yeah.
That is what the whole thing is called.
Okay. Because the question of the ideal city is like, okay, what is the ideal community? Because to a certain sense, a city is still the biggest human community that isn't imaginary. A city does concretely exist, even if perhaps it can get so big and so densely populated. It boggles a bit the human perception. It still concretely exists in a way that, say, a nation does not, and a country does not. Like there is a degree of separation and imagination in those that doesn't exist in a city. And I think
what about islands?
Depends on the size. Again, as with everything tangentially related to politics, nothing scales perfectly, both upwards and downwards.
Makes sense.
So the
so really, I mean, what is the ideal city? Is two questions. Right. It is, what is the ideal community in a more abstract sense, but also it can be a question of city planning. But first, for the abstract question, as you were going on about.
Yes. Essentially, if memory serves, the two examples of the ideal city, the city of God, the city of heaven, as opposed to the earthly city, essentially the profane city, is that God, even going with this angle doesn't really bring a satisfactory conclusion, because any possible segue I could have would boil down to, okay, what is the measure of happiness? Because like when you're asking what is the ideal X, it always boils down to how do you measure happiness? Should happiness even be the measure of ideal? Because after all, we now live in an age where we can manufacture happiness by using shit tons of drugs. Like if we use happiness as a measure, couldn't we just create a city where we shove people into chairs and have them receive controlled doses of heroines until the day they die, to live in perfect, eternal, ecstatic happiness every waking moment?
I mean, that then does get weird.
Yeah, but it's like, because I mean, I guess I immediately jumped the gun to the meat and potatoes of like happiness. We no longer live in pseudo agrarian conditions. Essentially, the pseudo agrarian in this case means rural plus industrial. Like we now live in a world where, say, the ideal city is that which produces happiness. It does not necessarily mean what the original thinkers did. Yeah, there's also a thing that a happy life isn't necessarily sunshine and rainbows. There's also a question of, can happiness be couched on ignorance? Like, to know that we are happy, we must also experience sadness. We can contrast it. So, like, happiness, I think the position I'm forwarding here is not actually that solid a measure, because it can essentially result in a hollow, drugged up hellhole. Not only will you eat peas in a pod, not peas in a pod, bugs in a pod,
Bugs
you
in
will
a pod.
also be tripping balls. all the time.
Yeah, obviously, this is sort of the main motif in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So a bit of a
It's true.
that is true. Yeah, which is obviously debates the question of what is the bounds of happiness, and
Yeah,
is happen
and fulfillment.
So that really gets into a question of moral philosophy of like what is utilitarianism, for example.
I mean, and another issue that utilitarianism does not have has a quantitative aspect, not a qualitative aspect, which utilitarianism does not deal with well. Like more happiness does not really factor in what's the quality of that happiness, because again, going back on the perpetual heroin injection chairs ideal, in a pragmatic way, yeah, no, that would be the highest objectively observable, well, not objectively, it's scientifically verifiable in terms of the chemical compound in our brain that we associate with joy, euphoria, etc. Best way to give it to the largest amount of people in the largest way. But would we all agree that it would be good quality happiness, or that it would be fulfilling, or that it would be a number of other considerations?
I think as on a gut level, most people would find that horrifying.
Reasonably so, but if you hold happiness to be the sole order of ideal, then that would be the logical conclusion. After all, no one can do anything besides be in the chair tripping out of their balls, and therefore can also not negatively impact anyone's life. And any positive impact that they could have possibly realized is already chemically realized by heroin. That people could develop a crippling addiction to heroin is tertiary, because they would always be supplied with heroin. Ergo, they would probably die before they actually felt ever the craves.
Right, but also I don't think you have to go as drastic as we are all in Matrix style put on a perpetual supply of narcotics, because obviously, as Epicurus was a happiness pursuer, but here, if we think of his happiness pursuit, right, its main principle was the avoiding of anything that could lead to pain. Which is most things in life. And so that begs the question of if to reach your happiness you have come to avoid all risk, and so have ended up not doing much at all. What kind of life is that?
It's the life of living in a heroin gas dispersal chamber 50 kilometers under the ground. Like, again, okay, so in this unexpected tangent that I don't know if Frank himself would appreciate, we kind of talked about happiness, but we also have the issue of other ideals. Like, maybe, I mean, happiness in of itself is an ideal, but like, for example, imagine order. Let's imagine stereotypically, I mean, we're all amongst monarchists and everyone assumes we're authoritarians, which is not necessarily wrong all the time, but still, order, right? The ideal city is the ordered city. What does this actually mean exactly? There is no set way, predetermined, universal type of ordering a city. A city that's built by zigzags, as opposed to a city that is made by lines. Essentially, both have order. It's just a different type of order, and one is not intrinsically superior or inferior to the other, because the purpose is to have order itself. So, like, I think, like, again, not to. I mean, this is a bit absurd since both you and I, Bronze, are idealists. So criticizing the pursuit of ideals as potentially self-destructive is while true, it does come a bit ridiculous when it comes from the same mouth. But at the same time, its rejection is also equally damning.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean that's where it does get weird, you know. But
Yeah, because
I
if you
think
reject,
because this could
this would be its own episode, honestly.
yeah, right. Let us therefore return to the less abstract aspect, which is to do with city planning, you know. Actual cities as we think of them in the real world. What do you think? And let us to make the question a bit easier. Let us say that, you know, we are no longer in the pursuit of the ideal city. We are in pursuit of the improved city. In what ways could we improve the city as seen today? Mostly in Europe, because that's what we know.
Again, the simple answer would be ban cars.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
I think, you know, like walkability and really just like considerateness would be the most important virtue to key in on if you're building a city. Like the city in its planning has to be considerate of the people and of its surroundings and of the environment and of all of those things.
Yeah, for example, an excellent historical example of this is ancient Athens, believe it or not. Athens, during some invasion, rather, I can't remember which one, got essentially burned to the ground. And when Athens was being rebuilt, they wanted an urban planning. But someone had the frankly genius idea to ask the citizens that survived of Athens, how did they want their streets? Did they want linear, clearly defined urban planning, or do they essentially want to return to how it was of the zigzagginess of the seats, the houses built very much together, etc., etc.? Guess who won? The zigzaggy house closely built together, because there is also an element of like human cohabitation, like of relation, of socialization. I think that when designing a city or really any habitation, one must not only focus on the logistical needs, get to place A to B, have access to food, water, etc., but also like on the more abstract ones, like for example, Le Corbusier, fantastic building, architecturally dubious, but fantastic in terms of space efficiency and finding houses to people. An aspect of the Corbusier that is often forgotten nowadays, I guess, because people just assume it to be normal, is the fact that it was incredibly alienating to the people who came to build to reside on it in the first parts, because it just segregated people so strongly. The distance between the neighbors was very intense, and essentially it broke down the the neighborhood dynamic that a lot of people that came in to live that were accustomed to. And I think that's something that any future city planning, either reappreciation, reevaluation, or root and stem building, the few that are nuts enough to do it these days, like the human element of community should be taken into account. I hold that even above the logistical considerations, since people will live there, and it is about people and their relation with their other fellow people that cities should really focus on, rather than this or that logistical consideration. Not to say they should be ignored, but they should take a secondary consideration, basically.
Yeah, I would agree. The human aspect of a city is very important.
Very important in of itself, but it should be taken more into account. I think we have to arbitrarily define this because poor Frank isn't here. So on to the next question.
Yeah, and I think we can take another question from Juanito. Hello, Juanito. What is your question?
Okay, well, the second question I asked was, as traditionalist, what do you mean when you say you want to preserve local identities and traditions? I understand that you're referring to smaller local organic identities. I know what you mean by that. What I mean, so what does it mean to preserve them?
That is an interesting question that has an admittedly also interesting answer, but it's a bit more boring because it boils down to policy. Like we have to, like God, this is going to be difficult to explain because a lot of our audience is English speaking first language and sometimes only language. So because this is something that is very clearly observable when you're anything but an English speaker, a native English speaker, is that you have, especially in the lexicon, the English words, terminologies, expressions, aphorisms, and affections essentially eating away at, primarily in this context, the language itself, the lexicon of the language. Even in Portuguese, for example, it's trivially common to have people to ask what's the Portuguese name for printer and stuff like that. It's low-key fucking horrifying to my core, but such is life. And so the preservation in this case means it essentially is in it, because again this is a bit kaleidoscopic and I don't know exactly every condition, but the main difference here advocated is a proactive attitude rather than a passive attitude, basically. Uh, and another thing, and this works more for quote unquote conservatives, because when we're talking about these local identities, cultures, etc., is that we have to realize that they're a living thing, not a dead thing. And because a lot of the times when we go into traditional means of cultural preservation, what you have is that they are essentially stagnated and ultimately killed due to that stagnation, that they're forced to adopt to a kind of idealized, typically how it was in the 1800s, give or take, stereotype of the culture. And this causes a divide to emerge between the people and their own regional culture. This is a very stereotypical process of nationalism, and well, not it's one of the mechanisms. And this kind of divide, which translates their culture and their identity from a living thing that changes and adapts to as the people themselves change, evolve, die, etc., to a completely dead thing that essentially cannot exist outside of the museum, because because basically the intrinsic automatic connection it had to its members was severed because it was effectively stifled to death. So so like so like there is again, there is no cut and dry issue. Every situation is unique and has to be analyzed accordingly. But the general terms would be this: a proactive a proactive stance, and above all, a less stifling chance that recognizes that this culture is the culture of the people as they reside, and it should ultimately be allowed to develop as they want them to organically, rather than being subjected to this or that directive from above. You could also say a bottom to top approach to it also helps. So yeah. Any comment, Bronze?
Yeah, no. I mean, I would agree that that's really important. Is to make it like an alive thing and not like a, and not something that's like, oh yeah, no, the part, not to be so glib about it. That, oh yeah, there's the guardian of the sacred flame and oh God, and it's this sort of tucked away thing, but that it's like a real and alive and authentic phenomenon.
Yeah, because the beauty of tradition is the unbroken line that goes from time immemorial, or not necessarily time immemorial. It could be just yesterday. Traditions can also be created, which is something that people sometimes have a difficult wrapping their head around. It's like it's the unbroken chain of humanity, of how we expressed ourselves and how we continue to express ourselves. It is a manifestation of life, death, and renewal in one single beautiful piece. That is why it is precious. That is why it in of itself has an artistic and emotional value that is difficult to put down. To reduce this to a static uh, painting that exists in a specific moment is to break this as harshly and as cruelty as just abolishing it for no other reason, because severing that connection is essentially the root of is what both conservatives and quote unquote libs do when they say when they either they quote unquote want to evolve the people from their backwards traditions, and when the others want to conserve them, they end up both killing them all the same. I think like this about ends this question, unless like Juanito wants to say something else.
Juanito?
Well, yeah, no, no, that I agree with all of that. My only issue is this: it's the do you see any way to really deal with at least what I see as the main issue, which is the omnipresence of commercial, pretty much Anglo commercial pop culture?
Well, that answer it seems like an insurmountable issue, doesn't it? The truth is, it isn't, because the answer is, what if governments invested in culture, which they don't? Because currently, the government in the West that invests the most in culture on the entire Western Hemisphere, uh, so like America, the continent, Europe, the subcontinent, Australia, New Zealand, all the countries that are stereotypically defined as West. Do you know what's the country that invests the most? It's France. Do you know what percentage of their GDP it is? Of not the GDP, their total budget? 1%. Most countries in the West invest less than 1% in their cultural budget. Understandably, this doesn't do much, now does it? If even almighty France, who with 1% has managed to remain this stubborn bulwark of its culture, though it has seen better days, to be fair, with just 1%, wowee, what if everyone else did it? Essentially, like, it seems like it's a big structural issue, like a big six-headed hydra, but the answer to Anglo cultural production is any other cultural production, namely your own, preferably, but having others also is kind of enriching and good. So yeah, it seems the big issue, but the answer is governments don't invest in culture. So
Yeah, it really is that simple. If there was any form of cultural policy,
which there rarely exists, though. To back on the thing we said about local culture, etc. Government should encourage culture, but not try to dominate it, because it kind of goes back to the thing we just said. It stifles it, kills it, separates it from its own people, and if you do that, that just facilitates the impenetration and over and like even you if you do that, you only encourage the spread of more American culture, because the people there develop a more direct connection to that, rather than their quote unquote own culture, because you try to control it, stifle it, and yeah. So support, not control. Frank has a new question, and this time he's here to say it. So could you unmute him so he can say his new question, because it's related to this one?
Yep. Hello, Frank. You can ask a question.
Hello, 1 sec. Maybe let me just can you explain what investing in culture would mean, and why would you do it?
Well, investing in culture, what does that mean? I mean, subsides for artists, basically. Like, again, it seems like it's a big issue, but it's not that complicated logistically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think it's but it's 'cause it's really it's prioritizing it, not only in with money, but also in like considering the cultural impacts of policy in other spheres as well. Is I think. But yeah, just like a lot, any, just like even a little bit of, but ideally this would be a sort of like everyone. Essentially it's like putting money into local cultural happenings and organizing events and so forth would be. But this would not only just be, something that the national government does, but also something that local communities should strive to do.
Yeah, not patrician, patronizing. Is that the correct way? Patronizing local artists and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's the correct word.
Okay, because again, we're all monarchists, and people assume that local culture they mean your ballet and opera and a house and stuff like that, and all that high culture stuff. Well, that is true. That goes back to That goes right back to the point I made earlier of trying to control it and trying to make it only high culture. That both cheapens high culture and separates the people from their own culture. It should be supported more openly with all. What I'm saying is, Western culture will have reached its high point when we have Queen Elizabeth II approved rap. I'm forwarding that position.
But
just imagine Elizabeth II listening to drill.
Can happen. You'd never know.
Yeah, that could be the future, but really, because it's not so much about like, oh, it's got to be the thing, and oh, the classical music is dying, and stuff like that. It's but really, it's not about.
Rivers also count as a place that sometimes necessitates patronship, because turns out shit has actually a shit ton of logistical obligations, because again, culture, and we're kind of narrowed down to musical production, which is just an aspect of culture, but it is one of where people are more intensely aware of the extreme variation in it. It should be all blanketed, supported, rather than this or that style or this or that thing. If there has to be a minimum criteria to it, is that it should be made by people who reside in the country, because not all music has actual lyrics in it. So the criteria of it being in the national language doesn't even apply fully. So,
But even if they were not from the country, I don't think there's I think
no, it's I guess we're going into very nuance. I'm talking about should reside in. It doesn't mean it has to be a national. It just should be there. It's easier to manage that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it should be there, but yeah.
It doesn't have to British. Anyone can participate in any culture. The best way to incentivize on culture is to make it easier, and is to incentivize, encourage, and spread out participation in that culture, not be restrictive about it. So yeah, you are accurate in that level. That has to be emphasized. Portuguese, French, or in English cultured person is anyone, irrespective of origin, that participates in the culture in a constructive way.
Yeah.
Further questions? I think we're back to Juanita.
Yeah, Juanita, you had an elaboratory question on culture?
Yes, it's yes, I keep asking the same question. So why do you think that the current nation states have no interest in trying to facilitate their stereotype of culture? The way Francisco Franco attempted to do so, with his stereotype of what he thought Spanish culture was. Why do you think that the modern Western states no interest whatsoever in trying to do this?
I think they might have interest in cultivating stereotypical culture, but that is, I think, a thing that might be divorced from authentic culture.
Another thing is
not to be completely Sartre about it.
Another thing is that there is also the fact that there is a historical process here. Franco wanted to create a Spanish nation at the expense of all of its regional cultures. Most contemporary countries, the nation is already a given fact, so they just don't see any political benefit in investing in it.
Right, yeah, because the thing that Franco was trying to destroy has already been destroyed, as it were. I mean, obviously, it not fully,
Yeah, but anyone in any country these days can go to essentially everything that isn't the center/capital and say that local culture is not looking up. So, yeah, I mean the historical reason, and if you're extremely cynical, contemporary reason is that these identity. Not to go, well, identity is always political, always has been, and always will be. People who say it wasn't are idiots who you should not take care, who you should not pay much attention to, or people who are old and aren't aware of this fact, who you should pay attention to, but on a conditional basis. That was a weird aside. But yeah, no, identity is an important thing to politics, no matter what. And breaking these local identities to force them to be more attached to the government, to have no alternative structures other than the parties, etc., is another avenue. Another thing is that, well, some people just assume that patronizing local cultures or culture in general is also a move towards nationalism, which, I mean, in a very oblique, kind of hysterical way, I can see it, but it's kind of extreme. And whether not investing in culture prevents the rise of nationalism and nationalistic feelings is also dubious. But yeah, the answer is multifaceted. There is no one true answer for every single situation, but suffice to say, none of them are truly satisfactory as well. Did this answer the question? Because, like, again, the answer is there's tons of reasons.
Yep. Nope. I got it. No, it makes perfect sense.
It's depressing, but sensible, I guess.
No, sense. Yes, exactly. It's sensible. Most of the answers are depressing.
Depression Chat 2021.
Depression Chat 2021. That's the I think we're nearing the end of today's broadcast because we've been going on for a bit now.
Let's hope to God this works. So,
but yeah, I mean, let's hope that there'll be anything to show for it. But I thought we could end with a light-hearted note, which is Young Loaf's question that he just submitted in the chat.
Yeah, I wanted to know your opinions on subnational monarchies. To give an example, I'm thinking about like Bavaria within the German Empire. What are your should they exist, and if so, what should the powers of the subnational monarch be?
its answer is a simple one. The answer is big up.
Based
in red pill. Subscribe to the end time. Praise to high heaven. And indeed, fact, the potential existence of subnational monarchies is, I hold, one of the better strengths of monarchism as an ideology abstractly conceived. Suffice to say, it is good. Basically,
they are based, and they should have the powers that are appropriate to them based on the circumstances, which will be varied.
True, but that's a bit unsatisfactory of an answer. The answer is they should have sufficient power so much that they don't suffer a similar process of being completely separated from the people and becoming this weird cultural relic that is static, dead, and separate from the people. So in short, they should be relevant to not only politics locally but also nationally. So yeah, no.
And culture locally.
Well, but like again, outside of France, historically, most cultural patronizing was done by monarchs. So I suppose we should say on the offhand that a Republican is listening to this, everyone in this voice chat is pretty much operating on the basis that monarchs just patronize culture as a matter of course. So if you just assume, if you wonder why, I mean, the reason why that is even more complicated, it has to do, actually tied with the notion of legitimacy we talked at the beginning of this, like that's just something kings do to be legitimate. It's actually more offensive and complicated, but suffice to say that everyone when we're talking about like kings and culture, we are going by the historical reality and base assumption that they would patronize it. Not necessarily well, but that they do it, they would. So yeah.
And this is something that came up in the last Q&A, and has to do with how this is already something that's happening in the although no longer reigning, still present local German monarchies, where you see
Local
that
Indian
even
monarchy as well. They also have that local in some previously deposed Indian dynasties also do important cultural activities, typically related to religion, but still important for culture.
Yeah, exactly. So already, even if they don't reign, you can already see that they have a positive impact on local culture and society. So I think, big up on local monarchies.
Yes, big ups. When in doubt, establish.
Yeah.
Is the policy that serve the 4 words.
Based.
And on that based note, I think that's a natural place to leave it for today's Q&A.
Indeed.
And we will hope that this is something that survives in to the future. So now I just have to figure out how to end up with some usable audio from this.
We pray to heaven.